Hi guys, welcome back. This week I'm going to be doing a new Napoleonic tutorial for you, but perhaps as you can kind of see in the back, things are a little chaotic around here this week. We've got a couple guests in, and I don't have a lot of time, so I wanted something a little bit more simple. Now, of course you may be saying, well, simplicity and Napoleonic figures, they don't usually go hand in hand, but I've probably chosen the only sort of army that has reasonably simple figures from that period, and that, of course, would be the Prussians. Now, not all Prussian uniforms are equally simple, but if you go for, say, their reserve units or their Landwehr, you get a pretty, you could end up with a pretty simple uniform. And this is indeed a Prussian reservist right here. And their uniform is pretty much gray from head to foot. Gray pants, a gray jacket, gray bedroll, gray boots, a gray black hat. I mean, gray, 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 gray. Very little color. I mean, there was variation per unit, obviously. But there's just going to be a lot of gray in this figure. As you can see, I've already base coated him and done his hair and face. This is, by the way, a Foundry figure if you're interested in picking him up. I'd say that Prussians are probably a good choice for people who want to start out painting Napoleonics but want something easy, something that won't take them much time. You can do probably lots of these guys pretty quickly because the uniforms are simple, the colors are simple. On the other hand, you may die of boredom from having to paint hundreds of very bland looking guys, but you know, some people don't mind that. But as I said, this guy's all gray from head to toe, and if you just paint him in all one shade of gray, every part of his uniform, that's not going to look very good. You really need to find a way to sort of differentiate the different areas. So that's what this tutorial is really going to be focusing on, is how you can sort of get variety and sort of interest when you're painting gray, and especially in a figure like this where you have the same color but you need to show, you know, some differences. So yeah, and gray is otherwise, I don't think, a very hard color to paint. As a matter of fact, you know, opposed to, say, white or black or something, it's way more forgiving. But it does show up in a lot of places throughout history in a lot of different uniforms, and I'm going to give you a variety of sort of approaches or kind of strategies for handling gray, which should be kind of useful to you going forward in whatever projects you're working on. So, okay, let's go ahead and get started. One shade of gray that I find really useful, particularly for Napoleonics, is sort of this warm gray color. It's sometimes called a French gray. At least that's kind of what it was called when I was studying art. Anyway, the way I'm going to be making it here is I'm going to be taking some Vallejo neutral gray, and I am going to be warming it up with a bit of field drab, so that's a brown color. And I think brown is a very nice color for sort of giving a tone to gray. It gives it some warmth, but it doesn't quite really make it red or pink like you can if you mix red or pink into your gray. And when you're doing this, you really don't want to use very much. So after I've put the base coat on, I'm now just going to add my first highlight. In order to lighten up that base, I'm just going to take some off-white, and I'm just going to sort of mix a bit of off-white into my base color to lighten it. And I'm just going to be using that process throughout here to build up lighter and lighter layers. You are going to want to make sure as you lighten the paint, not only that you're adding in the off-white, but that you're mixing in more and more of the field drab as well, because as you lighten it, you tend to dilute that sort of brownish color, so you have to keep, adding it. And I tend to, on the one hand, you want that color in there to be subtle, but on the other hand, you want there to be a really clear color cast. My experience is the lighter the colors you're working with, the less of that sort of tint color you need, and the darker the color, probably the more you're going to need to mix in to get a really clear result. So as you can see here, I've already applied 2 different highlight levels, and these are just all from mixing in gradually more off-white. And before finishing with the pants, I'm going to add 2 more highlight layers, so that's going to be 4 in total here. This is my last overall one, which you can see is going on to sort of all the high areas and creases in the pants and along all the seams and edges and stuff. And, it's getting feathered out, and I am building it up with some layers as I go. The fourth and final highlight that I'm going to put down is really going to be mostly an edge highlight. That's going to have quite a bit of the off-white in it, so it's going to be very light, and I'm going to really be using it just as a sort of emphasis on creases and edge pieces in these particular pants. With these Prussian Reservists, the gray of the pants is it's reasonably light, but it's not really light. It's not sort of on the sort of level of sort of the very white or very pale pants that you see in some other armies, like the French, for example, or the English. These pants are definitely a darker, more medium gray, but it's nonetheless on sort of the lighter side of things. And once the pants are done, I'm going to move on to the jacket. Now, there's nothing that says that you need to put a different tint in every gray on the uniform. As a matter of fact, I recommend that you don't, because you want things to feel a little bit unified. You want there to be a little bit of sort of things fitting together. And if you mix everything up, then it's going to be not so soothing to look at. It's going to make the figure look chaotic, I guess. So what I'm doing on the jacket here is I'm going to use that same sort of tone that I used on the pants, or sort of a warm brown color, but the only difference is I'm just going to start with a darker base and not lighten it or highlight it as far as I did on the pants. So here I've taken a mix with the neutral gray and I've darkened it down with some German gray to start, and then again just mixed in that field drab to get the warm shade that I want. And here I am again just doing as I did on the pants and just highlighting by mixing more lighter color. And I'm just again really lightening this using the off-white. Even though I'm starting out with a darker color initially, you can just still use the same color to lighten. You just don't put in as much so that it doesn't get so light so quickly. So yeah, that's just, you should watch with that, by the way, when you're lightening dark colors with a very light paint. A very little will go a long way, so you need to, you really need to watch that. So this first layer is really going to be going pretty much everywhere, because the Prussian jacket is not going to be anywhere near as dark as the base coat that I use. It's just going to be somewhat lighter than those pants. So you can see you don't want to leave very much of that initial layer exposed. And the second highlight is, again, repeating the process. Now I'm getting a little bit more selective about where I apply the paint, and I'm blending it out a little bit so that it's sort of thinner underneath the arms and in the deep recesses and like that. And of course, building up layers here. One thing you've also got working with you here is that because we put on such a dark base coat, you're going to get sort of a different effect, a different kind of look than you might if the base coat had been lighter, such as on the pants, because like white, gray is a fairly transparent color. So, it builds up a lot slower than some other colors. Well, faster than white, obviously, but it's still fairly transparent. So you can achieve different effects here by choosing whether you layer it over a lighter base or over a darker base. The third main highlight is just, again, more off-white added, and I have been really consistently continuing to put in that field drab color. I've actually been mixing more brown into the jacket gray than I was into the pants. So you'll see there's really a slightly, or at least you can maybe see that there's a slightly more brownish tint here. This color is going to be really focused pretty exclusively on the highlight areas, and I'm going to be layering it quite a bit to get lots of nice different light tones with the same color. So as I've described in earlier videos, that involves applying a thin coat of it, blending it out, and then applying a second coat over top and sort of progressively lightening it in that way. And the final step is to make an even lighter color. This color is in fact almost, or probably as light as some of the gray shades I was using on the pants, but I'm applying it very sparingly here, so it really is going to go only on the tops of, or along sort of the edge of creases where light is hitting, around the cuffs, those kind of places. It is an edge highlight essentially. So if it's used in a very sparing amount like I am here, it's not going to make the top feel as light or as bright as the trousers do. And now I'm going to start work on the spats. I'm decided that I would go for kind of a blue-gray color for these. So I've made a base here by taking a German gray, lightening it with just a touch of neutral gray, so it's not quite so dark. And then I've taken some Prussian blue, very appropriately, and mixed that in. As I mentioned before, because this is a dark color, you're going to need to add quite a bit more blue in to get a noticeably blue shade. So, you know, you can go pretty far with that. So here I'm just going to put this color basically on all areas of the spats and try to avoid getting it under the pants. Now, what I'm doing here is I decided that I was going to paint his bedroll using the sort of the same tones that I was using on the spats, but I don't want it to be as dark. I want it to be different. So what I've basically done is that color that I just used to base coat the spats has now been lightened, again using some of the off-white color with, again, more blue. I had to keep that blue tone in, and that's going to now be the base coat that I'm applying there. And then once I've got that color mixed, I'm going to use it to highlight the spats as well with sort of their first highlight layer. So these two areas are really going to sort of be similar color, similar tones, but it's basically a lot like what I just did on the jacket and pants, similar sort of tint color added, but I'm just working from sort of a different point, sort of a different base layer, and in that way I'm able to achieve sort of different colors. I then lighten that gray even further with the off-white, and you can see I'm now using that to sort of apply, actually this is really going to be the final highlight to the spats, so you can see that it's going along all the edges, the tops of all the wrinkles and creases and such, because these spats, from what I can see at least, were a fairly dark gray color, really actually very dark, and I don't want them to get too bright or too light or too over highlighted. So you know, I'm just going to be careful not to overdo it here. I'm just going to stop basically after this point, and I'm then going to use the same color too to continue highlighting the bedroll as well. But because the bedroll, I want it to, you know, look different, I'm just going to continue highlighting it lighter and lighter than I plan basically to go on the spats. And after that point, I basically went on, I think, add maybe 3 or even 4 extra highlight layers onto the bedroll above what I went and put on the spats. So I'm going to really get a much lighter blue-gray than what I have down below. And of course, besides lightening it with that off-white, I'm continuing to add in Prussian blue so that that blue tone doesn't get lost. One thing that I had fun doing here was, and one reason I made so many different shades is there's some really sort of very slight subtle wrinkles in the bedroll, and I used these sort of very gradually varied light gray shades to sort of very subtly define some of those creases in the fabric, and that can be just kind of a neat little detail. And it's one thing that you tend to see in better painted figures is time spent defining very subtle wrinkles. So if you want to take the time to do that, that's a great way to sort of differentiate your figure and sort of take it to the next level a little bit. And what I'm doing now is also a shade of gray, albeit an extremely dark one. So dark, in fact, that I want a black base coat on these areas. So you can see here, I'm going to be base coating his shoes, his cartridge case, and of course also the straps on his backpack, and finally his hat, using this just pure black paint. Now I'm going to start highlighting sort of the leather areas and these dark areas, first with German gray. And you may have noticed that these are the gray shades that I generally use when I'm highlighting blacks and leathers on my other figures. and they just make use of sort of the standard Vallejo grays right out of the bottle, and I think they still look very nice with these other grays I've created, and they're still, you know, very different and unique. My experience is if you use just the bottled grays like this, you're going to end up with something with a slightly bluish cast, though not very pronounced. So once I've put the German gray everywhere, I'm going to lighten my color with a little bit of neutral gray, and I'm going to start focusing on, you know, the areas where I want some highlight. Now that hat, I think, is cloth, so I'm going to keep it a little bit darker than the leather areas, make it look a little less shiny. So I'm not going to put any sort of highlights in the middle that look like they've got some shine. I'm going to avoid that, and the hat has some very subtle folds and creases on the top, and I'm going to be, you know, careful to really blend those and feather them out. And I'm just going to overall keep that at a sort of a overall darker level, basically, than the other areas. And I'm going to actually finish these areas with a sort of a final highlight of just pure neutral gray, and that's really going to be an edge highlight on the leather areas to make them look really shiny. So along the tops of all the straps and things, on the toes of the boots, that kind of thing, and that'll give it a little bit of a quality, like there's light hitting the leather and it's a little bit glossy. But you probably want to avoid that on the hat, or if you do it, only put it sort of on the bill or sort of really as very fine edges. I also decided to apply a non-oil wash to the hat once I was totally done, because I wanted to sort of unify the colors in the hat a little bit more, because applying a wash when you're done painting something tends to sort of pull the colors together a little bit, and it darkens the hat down a little bit, which is fine with me because I thought that allowed it to sort of look slightly different from the other areas painted with those colors, but, you know, without having to do any real extensive work to achieve that effect. Now, even though the reservists have a very plain gray uniform, they do have sort of generally one distinguishing marker, which is their collar, which is going to be painted sort of the color of their regiment generally. But it's even more simple than on a lot of other units where the collar would be sort of that, the whole collar would be that color. On the reservists, it seems that color is really going to only be applied to patches on the front of the collar. So the color I use here will depend on what unit you're painting. Obviously, I went for red because that seems to be a common choice. So I've just base coated that front part of the collar here using black red, and now I am going to lightly highlight it with some Citadel Mephiston red, and then follow that up with Evil Sunn Scarlet. This is a really, really small area, so you shouldn't have to spend too much time or effort getting, really doing any real extensive highlighting here. Now, the mess bag and backpack on these reservists was a couple of the few areas in this uniform that were not some shade of gray. They seem to have been sort of a warmer canvas color. So I'm just going to base coat them here using some Iraqi sand. Also, don't forget that these pieces are going to have some straps of their own, especially the mess bag. So be sure that you also remember to paint that using the Iraqi sand. To get some higher contrast, I'm going to apply a wash, but I don't want it to be too heavy a wash, so I'm using Seraphim Sepia here because it gives it a little bit, but it's not really powerful. I'm then going to be highlighting the backpack and mess bag here. First, just again with another layer of Iraqi sand, because after the wash dries, everything is going to be considerably darker. So if you just go back over with the base color, that's already going to be a fairly substantial highlight. But because from what I can see in pictures, this was fairly light fabric, I'm going to go further with it. So I'm then going to take and just mix some white into my Iraqi sand, and I'm going to use that as just a second highlight on these areas so that we can sort of get these really quite pale looking and very bright and light. And if you want, you can also even finish up with just some pure white, kind of thinned down because it's so transparent. It's not going to look just white. You're going to see sort of those base colors through it, and that can be kind of applied, at least I did, as a edge highlight on sort of the the edges of those flaps and a few areas or tops of wrinkles or things like that, just for a little bit of extra emphasis and just some higher contrast on the model. I'm then going to be painting his gun using my sort of typical musket barrel, rifle barrel color. So there's a base coat here of Foundry Bay Brown shade. And then I'm going to be highlighting the wood areas first by taking some Foundry Chestnut shade and apply it sort of thinly and layering it on most of the wood areas, focusing it towards the edges and sort of feathering it out from there so it's lightest at the edges and fades out. And then I'm going to take some Chestnut Medium, and I'm going to use that really as an edge highlight and sort of apply it to define sort of just all of the edge areas on the model. And because you want the gun to be nice and light and sort of yellowy looking, you can build it up several times to achieve the effect that you're looking for here. Now I'm going to do all the metal sort of steel areas, which are going to include the barrel of the gun, the bayonet, and the ramrod, basically. And I'm also going to be painting the buttons on his spats using this color. So I've just mixed a base here of German gray with a bit of Vallejo Air gunmetal. So for, again, the sort of dark metallic gray shade is what you're aiming for. And then I'm just going to take some pure Vallejo Air gunmetal, and I'm going to use that to lightly highlight the barrel and those areas. The bayonet, and for example, you can apply a lot more. You can make it a lot brighter and shinier because it's a blade. If you want, you could even go back in with some silver or something, really brighten it up, but that's up to you. And I'm just then also going to apply just a dot of the gunmetal as well onto his buttons to highlight those. There are also some gold kind of brass areas, and to do those I've made a mixture of German camouflage black brown and Vallejo Air gold, and I'll be applying that sort of various hardware on his gun. There's some rings, some clips, those kinds of things. The butt of the gun and such are going to get a base coat of that. And the buttons on his jacket also appear to be brass, so you should be painting them that way as well. And then when you're done, just go ahead and take some pure Vallejo Air gold and use that to apply highlights to all of those areas. Depending on how you went about painting the gun, you may also need to go back and do some various cleanup work with brown or dark gray or whatever to make sure that the edges and sort of dividing lines between the metal and wood areas are clean and even looking, and you know that you haven't like left any color off anywhere. And really the final thing left to paint on this guy is the strap on his gun, and I'm just going to be going with sort of a light white gray color for this. Again, I have base coated this here using Vallejo Sky Gray, and I'm then going to highlight it first with a mixture, sort of 50-50 here, of white and the sky gray, and I'm going to kind of be building it up so you can see it's lighter towards the top and gets darker down to the base. And the final highlight in this is just going to be pure white, which I'm just, again, going to be building up and layering it on so it's bright at the top and really bright along the edge of that strap in particular. Okay, and here is our finished Napoleonic Prussian Reserve unit wearing a great deal of gray clothing. I'm pretty happy with how this guy turned out, and you can see the difference between some of the gray shades here is quite subtle. Like, for example, between the pants and the jacket, there is a difference there, but it's not very pronounced. In reflection, I might next time make that stronger, that difference, but you don't really necessarily have to. And if you look at pictures of these guys, the difference between these is indeed not very great. But this figure, even though it's very plain, remains interesting because we've managed to integrate so many sort of different shades and tones into the figure, even though they're all really based on the same color by and large.
So I hope this at least gave you some ideas when you're painting your figures with gray about some sort of approaches you can take. Even if your guys are not going to have this much gray on them, you can look at how I handled certain pieces of clothing or equipment and sort of take some of my color combinations for your own usage. So once again, if you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, leave me comments with, your opinions, what you thought, and you can always also subscribe to my channel, of course, if you have not done so already. So that is all for now, and I will see you next time.